By the time the roof began to spit nails into the yard, Ada Bell was on her knees beneath the kitchen table, reaching under smoke and falling plaster for a cedar box no bigger than a family Bible. The floor had turned hot enough to bite through her boots. The curtains over the sink were gone already. One wall burned with that strange clean fury that meant oil, not accident, and still she kept one arm over her mouth and reached deeper with the other, because there were things in that box a woman could not leave behind even if the whole Wyoming night stood outside and begged her to live. The stranger saw her through the front window, just as the pane clouded black. He had been riding north with dusk in his teeth and the smell of sage in the wind when the first column of smoke rose above the cottonwoods along Bell Creek. By the time he flung himself from the saddle, the porch rail was burning blue at one end and orange at the other. He hit the door with his shoulder once, twice, and the third time it gave way. Ada heard the wood break, heard boots cross the room, and for one wild second thought the fire itself had grown a pair of arms. Then a rough voice close to her ear said to leave it, and she struck at him hard enough to make his lips split, because the box was under her hand now, and she would not go without it. He carried her anyway, one arm locked around her ribs, the other taking the cedar box when he felt her refuse to let it drop. Heat chased them out through the doorway. The roof behind them folded with a groan that sounded almost human. They hit the dirt together. Ada rolled, coughed, and came up on one knee, reaching back toward the house as if she might still outrun what was happening. The stranger grabbed her again, not gentle this time, and dragged her all the way to the water trough near the barn while sparks spun past like angry insects. She fought him until the porch collapsed inward and the front room vanished in a bloom of cinders so bright it turned the yard white. If you're listening tonight with a lamp on somewhere, maybe by a stove or a kitchen sink or a back porch gone quiet, tell me where you're hearing this from. I always like knowing how far a story travels before it finds the people meant to carry it a while. Because that night on the Powder River bench, with one house burning flat to its bones and the smell of wet ash already settling over the grass, there was no one there yet but a widow, a stranger, and the hard question of why she had run back in for a little cedar box when any sensible person would have fled with empty hands. Ada Bell was not sensible in the way other people use the word. She was 39 years old, 7 months widowed, and built with the kind of lean steadiness that came from hauling water, mending fence, and refusing help often enough that help stopped offering itself. Her hair had worked loose from its pins. One side of her face was streaked black. She snatched the box from the stranger's hands, checked the latch with shaking fingers, and only then seemed to remember she was breathing. He stood over her, coughing into the crook of his arm, taller than most men in the county and gone raw around the edges by weather, road dust, and something older that had hollowed him behind the eyes. His coat sleeve smoked at the cuff. He slapped it out without looking. More riders came when the bell at the church in Sheridan started up, slow and scattered on the wind. Nearest first was Ruth Tolland from the next claim over, a square-shouldered woman with flour on one wrist and her apron still tied crooked from supper. Behind her came Moses Wynn, the blacksmith's boy, who always tapped the toe of his boot twice before he spoke, and Deputy Hal Kettering with his spectacles sliding down his nose and his shirt half-buttoned wrong. They formed a line from trough to porch, tossing buckets that did almost nothing except keep the barn from catching. Ada never joined them. She stood in the open, clutching the cedar box to her chest, and watched her home fall room by room. When Silas Vane arrived in a buckboard 20 minutes later, his horses lathered but his collar still clean, he took off his hat like he was calling on a neighbor after Sunday service. "Mrs. Bell," he said in that smooth, unhurried way of his. "God help us. Are you hurt?" Ada looked at him so long the deputy stopped sloshing water just to hear the answer. "Not enough," she said at last. Silas Vane let that pass. Men like him had practiced letting things pass when they were sure the world would come back around to their side by morning. He owned more cattle than any 3 men west of Sheridan combined, sat on the bank board, held paper on half the freight wagons in town, and wanted Bell Creek because Ada's narrow strip of Homestead cut his south pasture from the best year-round water in 10 miles. He had asked Daniel Bell to sell twice while Daniel was alive. He had asked Ada once more after the funeral, standing in this same yard with his gloves folded in one hand and sympathy arranged on his face like a necktie. She had refused him all 3 times. Now he looked from the burning house to the widow in the ash and back again. "You cannot stay here tonight," he said. "My foreman can take you into town. We'll see to a room." "No. At least let us store what's left. There's not enough left to trouble you." His mouth tightened only at the corners. Not anger. Calculation. The stranger was standing off to one side by then, one hand braced on the trough, blood drying at his lip. Vane took him in with a glance too brief to count as rude. "And you are passing through," the man said. "Then you've had a heroic interruption." Ada turned to Ruth instead. Can she still hold the claim? That shifted the air more than the fire had. Ruth looked at Hal. Hal looked at Vane before he answered, and that alone told Ada what she needed to know. Daniel had filed under the Homestead Act 6 years earlier. 2 more weeks, and the proving papers would have gone in clean. With Daniel dead, Ada could finish it in her own name if she kept residence and improvements unbroken. But a burned house and one night gone elsewhere could be used by the wrong man in the right office to start whispering abandonment. Hal cleared his throat. "Best thing is stay on it if you can. Show continued residence. Rebuild fast." "How fast?" He did not answer. Vane did. Fast enough that the land office won't entertain a contest. And there it was, laid down plain between them in the sparks and dark. Not grief. Not charity. Time. Pressure. Erasure with paperwork instead of a pistol. Ada looked past him at the shape of her home collapsing into itself and knew, with a terrible steadiness, that if she let Ruth drive her into town tonight, Silas Vane would have her creak by winter. So when the last wall gave way and everyone stood there in the hiss of dying timber, she carried the cedar box to the root cellar door, set it on the ground, and said to the stranger, "Can you square a wall with green cottonwood and salvaged nails?" He looked at her a long moment, as if he were deciding whether she was mad or simply the bravest woman he had met in years. "Yes." "Good," she said, though her voice shook once on the word. "Then I expect we start at first light." That was the moment her world changed for good, not when the fire took the house, but when she chose the ash over the road and gave a nameless man a place to stand beside her. They slept what little remained of the night in shifts, if a person could call that sleeping. Ruth brought blankets and a kettle. Moses dragged over a broken door to lay across the root cellar opening so the damp wouldn't creep up into Ada's bones. The stranger stayed under the lean-to by the barn with his saddle for a pillow and one eye half open, like a man too used to leaving before dawn to trust stillness all the way through. Ada sat inside the cellar with the cedar box in her lap until the dark thinned blue along the creek and the burn in her throat settled into something she could work past. Inside the box were Daniel's final proof papers, 2 tax receipts, a seed ledger, the homestead affidavits waiting for signatures, and a folded packet of notes tied with a piece of harness string. Also one small thing that had no legal use at all. A scrap of blue calico from the dress she had worn the day she married Daniel under a stand of late cottonwoods, when she still believed the hard part of life came first and the reward part afterward. She touched that scrap once, then shut the lid and climbed back into the morning. The stranger was already pulling bent nails from charred boards and straightening them against the anvil stone by the shed. He worked like a man who understood wood from the inside, not chopping at it, not forcing it. Reading grain, choosing where to cut, where to save, where to let a warped board tell him what it wanted to become next. Ada watched for a while before taking up her own hammer. She knew measuring, bracing, and fit every bit as well as he did. Her father had been a wheelwright in Abilene before he lost his shop, and while her brothers ran wild, she had learned what held under strain and what only pretended to. That knowledge had followed her west in the joints of her hands. Men in town tended to forget it until something heavy needed mending. They worked mostly in silence until the sun rose high enough to turn the blackened yard silver at the edges. Then the stranger said, "Name's Eli Mercer." "Ada Bell. I know. Of course you do." He almost smiled at that. It was the first sign that a face existed beneath the dust and fatigue. Around mid-morning, he found the cast-iron stove door intact beneath a drift of ash and set it aside like a rescued child. Ada recovered a coffee tin of nails, 3 plates, and Daniel's square. The square stopped her. She rubbed soot from the worn oak handle with her thumb and stood very still. Eli, seeing it, kept his eyes on the boards in his hands. "You want the truth," he said. "That fire didn't start from a lamp kicked over in the night." She looked up sharply. "How do you know?" Because lamps don't burn cold at one wall and hot at another. Your porch rail caught first. Then that front room. Fast and even. Somebody laid oil where dry would take it. The words did not surprise her as much as they should have. Maybe because some part of her had smelled the same wrongness when she first woke, sharp and slick beneath the ordinary terror. Maybe because Silas Vane had arrived too composed for a man racing honest concern across bad road in the dark. Maybe because widows learned early which disasters belonged to God and which had boot prints in them. Ruth came back with biscuits wrapped in a towel and bad news under her tongue. Vane had been in town before sunrise. He had purchased the note on Ada's lumber credit from Haskell's yard and mentioned to 2 different ears that a woman alone on a contested claim would do better with cash in hand than pride in the dirt. By noon, 3 people had already repeated it with sorrow arranged carefully over curiosity. Ada listened without comment. Then she broke a biscuit in half and handed part of it to Eli. "You don't have to stay in this," Ruth said, low enough not to carry. "My place has room. Folks would understand." "No," Ada said. "Understand or approve?" Ada looked toward the creek where the cottonwoods leaned over the bank that Vane wanted. "Neither seems useful." The day stretched hard from there. Eli set corner posts. Ada cut brace notches. Moses came after his shift at the forge to shoe Ruth's mare and stayed to haul stone. By supper they had a foundation marked and a mean little plan scratched in the dirt for a 1-room cabin, tight and fast, just enough to satisfy the land office and keep out weather until spring. The easiest path was plain. Sell the frontage, take Vane's money, move into town where a widow could sew for board, and stop fighting men with papers. The harder path was work she might lose anyway, and she knew it. Just before dusk Hal Kettering rode in again, hat in hand this time. He would not meet her eyes. "Contest's been filed," he said, "on residence and improvement. Hearing in 10 days at the land office in Sheridan." Ruth swore softly. Moses kicked twice at a stone until it skittered off into the grass. Ada asked the only question that mattered. "If the cabin stands by then?" "It helps." "If witnesses swear I stayed?" "It helps." "What else?" Hal swallowed. "Anything showing continued intention to complete final proof. Receipts. Ledger. Affidavits. Anything sound enough that Mr. Pritchard at the office can't ignore it." Vane had not merely come for her land. He had come with schedule, signatures, and the comfort of knowing that pressure, properly timed, made most people fold themselves small. Eli watched Ada's face while Hal spoke, and in whatever he saw there, he set down his hammer for the first time all day. When the deputy rode off, Ada sat on an upturned water bucket and stared at the black footprint of her old front room. Eli came over with Daniel's square and laid it beside her without ceremony. "You can still leave," he said. "Town room. Sister somewhere east. Whatever you've got. And if I do, then Vane wins. He already thinks he has." Eli picked up a brace board, checked it, set it down again. Sometimes men like that mistake silence for agreement. Ada let out one tired breath that might have become a laugh on a kinder day. Most things worth keeping are put together twice. Once in hope, and once after the fire. He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his face eased as if she had handed him a sentence he had needed longer than she knew. Toward full dark she made the choice that cost her peace, reputation, and what little margin she had left. She opened the cedar box in front of Ruth and Eli, laid out Daniel's proving papers, the seed ledger, and the folded packet tied in harness string, and said she would fight the contest and name Vane if the evidence led there, no matter whose feelings it hurt or whose wages it threatened. Ruth nodded at once. Eli said nothing for a moment, then reached for a pencil stub and the back of an old flower broadside. "We'll need a list," he said. "What survived? What can be sworn? What can be built in 10 days? That night, while they planned by lantern on the root cellar door, the wind changed and came down off the bighorns cool enough to raise the skin on Ada's forearms. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, then you know the road that opened in front of her right there. Tell me, in your own life, how long you stayed polite once you understood someone meant to erase you. The answer says more about a person than comfort ever will. The next days moved with the tight, breathless pace of anything built under threat. Eli and Moses felled young cottonwood at first light and hauled it back by team. Ada split kindling, cooked over a trench fire, sorted every paper in the cedar box, and measured wall lengths until numbers swam in front of her eyes. She felt grief in her body, not as weeping, but as fatigue, a deep, wool-heavy drag inside the chest that made even lifting a pail feel like an argument. When she stood still too long, she could smell burned wallpaper in her hair. Silas Vane pressed from 3 sides at once. Haskell's yard refused her credit. 2 ranch hands who had promised to help frame the roof sent apologies through their wives after Vane mentioned winter feed accounts. A man from the bank arrived with a polite inquiry about Daniel's outstanding equipment balance and lingered over the wreckage long enough to let her know it had not been an accident of timing. Through it all, Vane himself remained cordial. He rode by one afternoon, glanced at the half-raised wall, and said, "You always were stubborn, Mrs. Bell. Daniel admired that about you right up until it cost him sleep." Ada stepped down from the sill she was fitting and faced him with the hammer still in her hand. "If you've come to help, there's work." "If I'd come to help, I'd have brought a bill of sale." "Then ride on." His gaze slid to Eli. "And you? You planning to winter here now?" "Planning to finish what I started," Eli said. Vane smiled the way men do when they mean to remember a slight. "Careful. Some fires mark a man twice." The words landed harder than they should have, which told Ada there was a history there. She waited until Vane had gone before asking. Eli was fitting a joist when he answered, not looking up. Years earlier, in a railroad camp outside North Platte, a bunkhouse stove had overturned in a storm. He had made it out. His wife Clara and their little girl had not. He had gone back once and been driven out by heat before he reached their room. Since then he had carried the plain and merciless belief that a better man would have gotten them clear. Ada set her hand on the board between them. "You went back this time." He kept working, but his jaw tightened. "Maybe that only means I failed the first time." By the 6th day the walls stood chest high and the roof beams were ready, but trouble sharpened. Moses arrived before sunrise one morning to find their team loose and the harness cut clean through. Ruth saw Boone Kersey, Vane's foreman, crossing the lower ford in the dark with a coil of rope he did not bring back. Hal took the report and did nothing. That afternoon Ada, sorting the packet of Daniel's notes for anything useful, found a folded plat she had never opened. It showed the creek line as Daniel had surveyed it the previous spring, with bearings and distances in his cramped hand. At the bottom, in different ink, was Silas Vane's signature beneath a statement acknowledging the shared diversion ditch between the Bell claim and Vane pasture before final fencing. Eli studied it, ran his thumb over the notation marks, and his whole posture changed. "This matters," he said. "It's only Daniel's scratch work. No, it's the original meander line. See here? These chain lengths. And this corner reference to the split cottonwood. If Vane's current fence stands where I think it does, he moved it west after your husband filed. He's contesting the claim because he needs the office to accept his lie as the newer truth." That was the one piece of revelation the story had been walking toward, not a rescue falling from the heavens, but the world closing a loop around what Daniel had left behind and what Ada had almost died to save. The fire had not been just to frighten her. It had been to destroy the only paper showing Bell Creek as it really ran. They needed someone besides themselves to read the survey marks. The county surveyor, Josiah Pike, had left his office months earlier after a public quarrel with Vane over grazing boundaries and was said to be drinking his way into blindness up north of Goose Creek. Ada rode for him that same afternoon with Moses and the folded plat tucked into her shirt. They found Pike in a sod dugout behind a trapper's shack, beard full of pipe ash, hands still steady enough to hold the paper. He stared at Daniel's notes a long time. Then he said Vane had indeed shifted 2 markers during spring runoff and bullied the temporary deputy into signing a corrected field sketch. Pike had refused. Pike had also sold his team to pay doctor bills and was in debt to Vane's bank besides. "Then come anyway," Ada said. "Ride in my wagon if you must. Sit in that office and read your own profession honestly one last time." He looked at her over the edge of the paper. "That costs me." "Yes," she said. "It does." On the ride back, they were met at the narrow cut by Boone Kersey and another rider with bandanas at their throats. Boone smelled of clove tobacco and kerosene, the same wrong sweetness Ada had caught on the fire night without knowing it. He did not point his revolver at her. He pointed it at Moses, because cruel men often preferred the easy lever. He told Ada to hand over the papers and stop making difficulties for people better set in the world than she was. Eli, having guessed where she'd gone, came hard down the rise behind them on horseback just as Boone reached for her reins. What followed happened quickly and with the blunt, ugly logic of men deciding how far they are willing to go. Boone struck Moses from the wagon seat. Eli hit Boone broadside before the revolver cleared leather. One horse screamed. The plait slid from Ada's shirt and blew under the wagon. Eli and Boone went down in the gravel, fists and elbows, Boone reaching again and again for the gun, Eli stopping him with the kind of force that spoke not of practice but of fear. Ada jumped down, crawled beneath the axle, and came up with the paper just as the second rider grabbed her arm. She drove Daniel square into the man's wrist by instinct alone. He yelled and let go. Then there was a single terrible pause. Boone had the revolver half-raised. Eli had one hand on Boone's throat. Ada saw, with the clarity people get only in moments that divide a life, exactly what could happen next. Eli could take the gun. He could end Boone where he lay. There would be reasons enough. Fire. Threat. Moses bleeding by the wheel. Every ounce of grief Eli carried might have found a simple outlet in that one squeezed second. He did not do it. Instead, he knocked the gun aside, got to his feet, and hauled Moses back into the wagon while Boone scrambled off cursing. The riders fled down the cut, one holding his wrist, the other spitting threats they would never dare repeat before witnesses. Eli swayed once when it was over. Blood was running from a split along his ribs where Boone's spur or buckle had caught him. Ada pressed a hand there and felt heat soak through it once. By the time they reached the homestead, dusk had settled, and the half-built cabin stood black against a copper sky, looking for all the world like a promise too fragile to last the night. Hell finally came when Ruth sent her youngest for him. He took Boone's dropped revolver, heard the account, and said he would do what he could, which in Sheridan usually meant whatever did not offend a wealthy man until facts made offense unavoidable. Eli refused a doctor. Ada ignored him and heated water anyway. The question at the end of that long day was not merely whether the cabin could be finished or whether the land office would believe them. It was whether two people already half-charred by old losses could hold to decency long enough to keep from becoming like the harm done to them. They finished the roof in a wind that tugged every loose board like a hand trying to pry them apart. Eli worked through pain until his face went gray under the sun. Ada climbed where he climbed, braced where he braced, and when one beam fought true, she set her shoulder to it beside him instead of asking him to bear it alone. By afternoon, the one-room cabin stood roofed, rough and narrow, with a door made from salvaged planks and a window no bigger than a washpan. It was not pretty. It was enough. Sometimes enough is the holiest shape a house can take. That evening, after Ruth had taken Moses home stitched and sore but alive, after Pike had finally agreed to ride in for the hearing if Ada sent the wagon for him at dawn, after the last hammer lay quiet, the world gentled by one notch. Eli sat on the root cellar step with his shirt open at the ribs while Ada cleaned the cut with boiled water and whiskey. The skin around it was swollen purple. He flinched only once, then apologized for the flinch as if pain were a discourtesy. "Don't," Ada said. "Old habit. Bad one." The dusk smelled of sage bruised under boots and fresh-cut cottonwood still green at the core. A meadowlark called once from the fence line, late and lonely. Ada tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels. The nearness of him felt different now, no longer a problem to be managed but a fact too living to ignore. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked out at the new cabin instead of at her. "I kept moving after Clara died," he said. "Told myself road dust was better company than a room full of memory. Truth was, I didn't trust any place that asked me to stay. Thought if I never belonged again, I could never fail anything that badly again." Ada held Daniel square across her lap. She had been carrying it around all day without noticing, like some people carry a prayer. "After Daniel died, everybody brought pie," she said. "Then they brought advice. Then they brought silence. I got so used to answering silence with more silence I started thinking that counted as living." He turned then. Firelight from the cook pit caught in the scars on his knuckles. "Did it?" "No." For a while neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the cottonwoods by the creek. At last Eli said, so quietly it might have been meant only for the dark between them, "Some things don't quit hurting. They just learn where to sit." Ada closed her eyes on the sting of that because it was true, and because truth spoken without performance can feel more like touch than language. She opened the cedar box, took out the blue calico scrap, and then Daniel's old pocket watch with its cracked crystal. She held the watch out to Eli. "This belonged to the man who taught me a home is work done beside somebody, not walls. He'd hate that I'm giving it away this easily." Eli did not take it at first. "Why me?" "Because you ran toward the fire when you could have ridden on. Because you stayed when leaving would have cost you less. Because I think a man ought to carry something that reminds him he did one thing right." He took the watch then, careful as if it might bruise. In return, he reached into his saddlebag and brought out a little tin horse cut from sheet metal, one ear bent, the paint burned off one side. "Clara made that for our girl," he said. "I've carried it so long I forgot it was meant to be touched." Ada took it into her palm. The edges were smooth from years in a pocket. What passed between them there was not dramatic and not safe. Just mutual recognition, which is rarer and dearer than people admit. If that's settled somewhere tender in you, then you know why stories like this matter. Leave a like, subscribe, and stay close if you want more of this kind of company. Because sometimes the truest comfort is simply being reminded that broken people are not finished people. They did not kiss. Not then. That mattered. Instead, Ada arose to bank the fire and nearly stumbled from weariness. Eli stood at once, caught her elbow, and then let go the instant she had her footing, a restraint so instinctive and respectful that Ruth, watching from where she tied her mule, looked away on purpose to give the moment back to them. Later, when Hal came with word that Boone had not been found but Vane was calling the cut road fight an attack by a drifter on honest employees, Ada had a chance to tell the story in a way that would have won her easier sympathy. She could have made Eli the whole hero and herself the helpless widow. She could have leaned on the town's appetite for neat roles. She did not. She gave the account plain. Moses spoke up from the wagon to correct one detail in Eli's favor. Hal wrote it down. Ruth noticed the choice and said nothing, which was how Ada knew it mattered. Taking less than she was owed had always been different from pretending she had done nothing. The line was narrow. That night she walked it clean. Before sleep, Eli spread his blanket inside the unfinished cabin rather than under the lean-to. Not close, not improper, just inside the same walls they had lifted together. Ada lay on the floor by the opposite corner, the cedar box under one hand and the tin horse under the other. Through the rough new boards, she could hear the world still moving beyond them. Creek water over stone, a horse stamping, some far-off coyote trying the dark. Something between them had changed in a way that could not be undone. But morning still held a hearing, and Sheridan still belonged more to Silas Vane than to Truth. The land office sat above a mercantile on Main Street, with fly-specked windows and the smell of ink, dust, and damp wool. Ada wore her plain dark dress and the one hat the fire had spared because it had been hanging in the root cellar. Eli's coat had been brushed clean, though the tear at the ribs could not be hidden entirely. Vane was already there, gloved and immaculate, Boone at his shoulder with a bruise yellowing under one eye, and Righteousness borrowed fresh for the occasion. Mr. Pritchard from the land office sat behind a table with the patience of a man who preferred property to people because property lied less creatively. The hearing began with paper. It often does. Vane produced a corrected field sketch, affidavits from 2 hired men claiming the Bell place had fallen into neglect since Daniel's death, and a statement expressing regret that a woman alone could not reasonably be expected to maintain so difficult a claim. He delivered it all without ever raising his voice. Ada answered with receipts, seed ledgers in her own hand, Ruth's sworn statement, Moses's, the tax records, and photographs from the Sheridan studio, taken the previous spring, showing Daniel standing by the diversion ditch exactly where Vane now claimed his fence had always been. Piece by piece, the room changed temperature. Then Eli spoke. He described the fire pattern, the oil burn on the porch lintel, the impossible speed of ignition. Boone smirked until Eli set the dropped revolver on the table and named the cut road encounter in such spare detail that even Mr. Pritchard stopped shuffling papers. Vane objected to the relevance. Mr. Pritchard allowed it. Hal Kettering, called next, admitted under oath that Boone's revolver had been recovered from the scene. Still, it was not enough by itself. Suspicion is not proof, and Vane knew how thin outrage can sound inside an office. So Ada untied the harness string around Daniel's folded notes and laid the original plat on the table. Pike, brought in on Ruth's wagon and combed into a decent likeness of his former self. leaned forward with both hands braced on his knees, and read the bearings aloud. Then he compared them to Vane's corrected field sketch and pointed out where chain lengths had been altered, where the Cottonwood reference had vanished, where the meander line had been moved west to absorb Bell Creek frontage into Vane pasture. He did not speak dramatically. Men trusted him more because he sounded mildly offended by bad arithmetic. Mr. Pritchard asked if he would swear to it. Pike said yes. Vane's smoothness broke at last, not in fury, but in impatience. He called Pike bitter, Eli vagrant, Ada hysterical by implication, if not by name. And that was his mistake. Because pride, more than cruelty, undoes men who are accustomed to being believed before they have earned it. Mr. Pritchard requested the bank copies of the corrected sketch filings. Haskell, the lumberman, who had come only to observe and preserve his own advantage, cleared his throat and admitted Vane had asked him to hold Ada's credit specifically until after the hearing. Ruth added that Boone had ridden from Bell Creek on the night of the fire smelling of coal oil. Moses, pale but stubborn, testified that Boone had threatened to finish what he'd started at the cut road. The truth did not arrive like a posse. It arrived like weight, one decent thing laid atop another until the table could not tilt anymore. By noon, Mr. Pritchard suspended the contest, ordered an official resurvey, and entered Ada Bell's residence and continued improvement into the record pending final proof. By evening, the resurveyors, walking from the split Cottonwood and Daniels bearings, placed the line exactly where Ada and Eli had said it ran. Vane's fence stood wrong by nearly a quarter mile. His grazing papers on the disputed strip were frozen. Boone was taken into custody the next morning on charges tied to the assault, and, later, the arson. Once a lamp oil ledger from Vane's own supply shed surfaced under subpoena. Vane himself was not hauled away in irons. That would have been too clean and, in some ways, too easy. What happened instead suited him better. The bank asked for his resignation from the board. 2 cattle contracts were reviewed. Men stopped removing their hats so quickly when he entered rooms. Power leaked out of him through 100 ordinary cracks, and nothing frightened him more. When the dust settled enough for settlement papers to be discussed, Vane sent word through an attorney that he would cede the creek frontage clean, pay rebuilding damages quietly, and forego appeal if Ada would refrain from pressing for attachment on his south pasture beyond what the court required. She could have asked for more. With the false survey and arson tied to his operation, there were pieces of him she might have broken off and kept. The town knew it too. Ruth's brow went up when the offer was read. Eli said nothing at all. Ada took a night to think. In the morning she accepted only what restored what had been hers. Title clear, damages enough to finish the house, wages for Moses's lost forged time, and formal written access to Bell Creek that no man could nibble away later with a pencil. No extra strip. No humiliation clause. No stripping him bare to feed her satisfaction. When the papers were signed, Mr. Pritchard glanced at her once, then at Vane, and the look alone said he understood exactly what she had chosen not to take. Sheridan changed after that in the practical ways towns do when a fact becomes too public to deny. Haskell extended lumber again, this time before being asked. Hal Kettering, who had spent too long confusing caution with fairness, began showing up at the Bell place on Sundays with small useful things and no speeches. Pike quit drinking himself blind and took temporary survey work east of Buffalo. Moses told the cut road fight 6 different ways to 6 different audiences, each version making Ada's square a little more legendary than the last. Ruth started bringing supper not because Ada needed it, but because she liked sitting at a table where no one pretended plain truth was impolite. And Eli stayed. Not because anyone trapped him with gratitude. Not because grief had vanished and made room all at once. He stayed because when the damaged porch beam needed replacing, his hands knew the timber. When the roof wanted shingling before first frost, his ladder was already against the wall. When Ada rose before dawn to walk the ditch line, there was another pair of boots by the door without either of them making a thing of it. Love, when it came between them, did not arrive as thunder. It came the way weather shifts on the plains. First a different taste in the air, then the curtains moving. Then one day you realize the whole house has been breathing with it for weeks. The first kiss happened while setting the permanent front door. The new hinges complained. Ada laughed under her breath. Eli steadied the frame with one hand and touched soot, long since washed but somehow still remembered, from the place near her temple where the fire had marked her months before. Then he waited. She closed the distance herself. It was brief, honest. The kind of kiss that does not ask the world to stop, only asks whether two people might finally stop standing outside their own lives. Winter came, and the new house rose where the old one had stood, larger by one room and stronger in every joint. Ada planted 2 more apple saplings beside the 3 Daniel had started. Eli built a shelf over the stove for the cedar box, and when he set it there, he did not ask what part of the past still belonged inside it. She showed him anyway. The calico scrap. The proving papers now stamped and complete. Daniel's final letter, which turned out not to be a secret of betrayal or surrender, but a page of instructions about the south fence and a note in the margin reminding Ada to oil the new pump handle before frost. She laughed when she read that and cried a little after, and Eli sat beside her through both without hurrying either one along. By spring, folks stopped calling him the stranger. By summer, he had a field of his own underbell water on a lease he and Ada signed together. Not marriage yet. Not because they did not mean it, but because 2 people who had both lost hard were entitled to build slowly and call that courage. When he asked, months later under the same stand of cottonwoods where Daniel had once put a ring on her hand, he did it without kneeling and without flourish. He simply said he had spent enough years mistaking loneliness for penance and would like, if she agreed, to spend what remained getting ordinary things right beside her. She said yes before he finished. Years later, people still told the story wrong at first. They would say it was about a widow who would not leave a burning homestead and a man who ran into the flames after her. And that part was true. But the deeper truth was what happened after the running and the burning were done. The part where she let herself be helped without surrendering herself. The part where he stayed long enough to learn that saving one life does not cancel another loss, but it can teach a heart where to set down its weight. The part where a town watched the quiet sort of goodness hold under pressure and had to admit it had underestimated both of them. One August evening, nearly 3 years on, the orchard finally gave a decent crop. Ada stood at the kitchen table slicing apples for preserves while a little girl from Ruth's family shelled peas on the porch and argued with Moses's youngest over whose turn it was to pump water. Eli came in from the lower field with dust to his knees and the late sun caught in his hair, set his hat on the peg by the door as if he had always known where it belonged, and smiled when he saw the jars lined up cooling in the window. He rested one hand on the frame he had built, looked at the full room, and said, "Best rooms I ever knew were built after the first plan failed." And the lamp glowed warm against the clean glass while evening settled around the rebuilt house, and smoke rose straight from the chimney into the gold Wyoming dusk. Next time, I'll tell you about the ranch hand who buried a lockbox no one was supposed to find, and the schoolteacher who unearthed it 20 years later when the drought split the earth open. Until then, keep the lamp lit.